Hi class, today we are going to look at an example where we find the standard deviation with a calculator when we have two lists. So the problem states, use the data from the following table and your calculator to find the standard deviation and variance of the frequency distribution. So first off, I'm asked to find the standard deviation and the variance. Remember, we have both a population standard deviation, which we called sigma, and a sample standard deviation, which we called S, or S of X in your calculator. So the first thing I want to ask myself is, which one am I looking for? Am I looking for a statistic, or am I looking for a parameter? Am I looking, in other words, for S, or am I looking for sigma? The rule of thumb that your homework uses seems to be, if you are not told that it is a population, in other words, if you don't see the word all or total or the word population or words like every, you're going to assume that it's a sample. So we are going to be looking for SX. And then if you remember, the variance is just the standard deviation squared. Okay? So these are the things that I'm going to be looking for in my calculator. All right, but where and how do I find that? So first off, notice that your table is on the left middle of the PowerPoint. Our class column is divided, of course, into classes. So I have two numbers in each column. My first class, for instance, is 60 to 69, and then my next class is 70 to 79, and so forth. I cannot enter in two numbers into the same list in my calculator. So what I'm going to do is have to find a number to use for each, to represent each class. That number is going to be our class midpoint. So my first step before I go to the calculator, after we have determined if we're looking for S or sigma, is to go ahead and find the class midpoint for each class. So again, I mentioned that our first class is 60 to 69. So I'm going to find the midpoint, and in order to do that, remember I add 60 and 69 and I divide by 2. In other words, I am finding the average of the two class limits, or the upper and lower class limits. So that's going to be 60 plus 69 divided by 2, and I get 64.5. Now I can keep doing this for each class, or remember we had a trick where we can just add the class width to our first class midpoint to find the other class midpoints. Well, the lower limit of my first class is 60, and the lower limit of the second class is 70. So I subtract to find the class width, which 70 minus 60 is 10. So I'm just going to add 10 to 64.5, and I get 74.5 for the second class midpoint. I repeat, and I get 84.5 for the third class midpoint. I repeat one final time, since I have 4 classes, to get the final class midpoint of 94.5. Okay? So my class midpoints are going to go into L1. Okay, if we remember this from earlier in this section, we used L1 in our calculators. So my L1 list is going to be 64.5, 74.5, 84.5, and 94.5. What's different now is that I have two lists. I have both a class list and a frequency list. My frequency list is going to go into L2. So I just write out the frequencies for each class and put those into L2. So the frequency of the first class is 4, for the second class 8, for the third class 6, and for the last class 2. So my L2 is going to look like 4862. Okay, so now that I have my L1 and L2, now that I know that I'm looking for SX and SX squared, I can go to my calculator. So here I have my calculator. I first want to go ahead and enter in my lists. So in order to do that, I'm going to hit Stat and Edit. I have my list already entered here. L1 is again 64.5, 74.5, 84.5, 94.5. L2 is 4, 8, 6, and 2. Keep in mind that both your L1 and L2 lists need to be the same length or you will get an error message. Also make sure that each frequency in L2 matches the corresponding class that it should go to for L1. So make sure that both lists are in the correct order as well. Okay, so take a minute, pause the video if you need to follow along and type in these lists into your calculator. Okay, now that you have those lists in your calculator, we are going to go to one-var stats. So I'm going to hit Stat. I'm going to tab 1 to the right to get to Calculate, or CALC, and then the first option is one-var stats. So I'm going to hit that button, and I should be taken to the one-var stats menu if you're on the new operating system. Here in a minute, I will show you what it will look like if you have the old operating system. So the first list, or the first menu option that I have here is List, and I want to make sure that that's L1, or in other words, I want to make sure this is the class list. Okay, whichever list that you used to represent your classes, that's going to be L1. I already have L1 listed there, so I'm just going to tab down to the next option, which is my frequency list. So here is where you're going, usually you leave it blank if you only have one list, but now we have a frequency distribution, so I need to go ahead and input that frequency list. In our case, that was L2. So I'm going to hit second, and then the number 2, to get L2. Now all I have to do is hit Calculate, and my calculator will do the rest for me. Again, we just mentioned that our problem did not mention the word all or population or anything like that. So we are going to assume that we are looking at a sample, which means I'm going to look for SX. Okay? Or S of X. So I'm going to say that my standard deviation is 9.23. Okay? On Pearson, you will be told how much to round or how many decimal places. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and write out my standard deviation, so as 9.23. All right. Now I'm going to go back to the calculator. You might notice on my calculator that I don't have the variance, or S of X squared. I have to do that, unfortunately, by hand. So what that means is I'm going to write out that whole number that I see for S of X. I need to write that whole decimal and square it in my calculator. All right, so I'm going to take 9.233,805,169. Okay, and I'm going to take 9.233,805,169, and I'm going to square it. Okay? So I have to then move back to my calculator, go to the home screen, and square that in the calculator by hand. And when I do that, I get 85.26. Okay? So I have now answered the question. Now the instructions that I just gave you are related to the new operating system. If you do still have the old operating system, when you hit one var stats, you'll be taken back to the home screen. And then what you'll do, you'll see one var stats. You'll have then you'll just have comma, and you'll enter in L1, enter in another comma, hit L2, and then press enter. And you'll get the same readout that we had on the new OS.